There's seats down here in front, if one wants it. Good evening. I'm Bertram Ashe, professor of English in the University of Richmond English Department. And I'd like to welcome you to the latest talk in the University of Richmond English Department's Writer Series. David Shields teaches in the English Department at the University of Washington and has published a total of 10 books, including The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead, a New York Times bestseller, Black Planet, Facing Race During an NBA Season, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circles Award, Remote, Reflections on Life in the Shadow of Celebrity, winner of the PEN Revson Award, and Dead Languages, a novel, winner of the PEN Syndicated Fiction Award. What I find most amazing about Reality Hunger, David Shields' new book, is its narrative cohesion. In much the same way that he did in Black Planet and more recently in The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead, is that Shields somehow crafts extremely compelling, completely absorbing reading experiences out of snippets of reference material, anecdotes, stray quotations, short overheard conversations, and other seemingly extraneous gestures. I couldn't stop reading Black Planet or The Thing About Life or Reality Hunger until the final page. And I really had no choice in the matter. David's books have the peculiar effect of forcing me, anyway, to carry them around with me all the time. David Shields' books tempt me at red lights, demanding to be read even though I know green is only seconds away. And for a period of time, even after finishing these books, I find myself still carrying them around as if the books, as material objects, are as valuable as the ideas inside. In his new book, Reality Hunger, a Manifesto, David Shields takes a long, ecstatic look at nonfiction, but not just any nonfiction. He's championing reality-based art to the extent that he's written a supporting manifesto. And a major theme of Reality Hunger is appropriation and plagiarism and what those terms mean. David Shields argues that an essential part of Reality Hunger is that reality cannot be copyrighted. He says, among other things, quote, "Life doesn't have narrative lines. Reality-based art, unprocessed, uncut, underproduced, splinters and explodes. The novel is dead. Long live the anti-novel built from scraps." I love this book. I fought with this book. Some of the ideas are so close to how I feel that I could have written the book myself, and yet as someone who loves the novel, some of Reality Hunger's claims completely oppose how I feel. It's a book that delighted me, it's a book that challenged me, it's a book that infuriated me, it's a book that provoked me. Many books are called important. David Shields has written a book that actually is important, and we're delighted to have him with us tonight. Please help me welcome David Shields.
Thank you, Bert, for those very... Do you hear me back there fine? Is that carrying well? Thanks, Bert, for those thoughtful and generous comments. I think I'll read for, or actually I'll talk about the book for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then I'll welcome your questions. It's very much a book meant to provoke and to incite, I suppose. And so please feel free to ask questions afterward, challenge me, question me, etc. So the first thing I wanted to bring up is this thing I usually start with, which is that when I give a formal talk, I often stutter a bit. I grew up with a fairly bad stutter as a kid, and I still stutter a bit sometimes. And so rather than have that be the elephant in the room that no one's talking about, I sort of like to just get it out there and say it so it's not this weird shadow in the room. So anyway, that's something I'd like to begin with. And it's also oddly relevant to this book in the sense that when I was a kid, I was sort of like this little 6-year-old Derridian deconstructionist who had a very bad stutter. And because I stuttered as a kid, I was very aware of the self-reflexive nature of language as a sort of reverb effect, of the ways in which a language is always recursing and always reinscribing itself. And then I also grew up with two journalist parents. I grew up in LA and San Francisco, and both of my parents were, as I say, journalists, and there was a sense that they believed in this sort of transcribable reality and transparent language that would convey the real, that I very much grew up in the realm of the real. And there was a wonderful line by Walt Whitman that could have been inscribed on our welcome mat, which was, "The true poem is the daily paper." You know, that was sort of our working definition. And I feel like in many ways this book of mine, Reality Hunger and Manifesto, is a weird collision of my parents' view of language and reality, which is a sort of journalist view, and in a way a stutterer's view of language and reality, which is that we can never quite get there, that the language is always this sort of self-canceling, self-reflexive substance. I think what those two things produce in me is a sense of, one of the big arguments of the book is that nonfiction isn't true. Nonfiction is a framing device to foreground contemplation. Memory itself is a dream machine. The moment that we compose, we're inventing. And it's, to me, crucial to go back into the history of nonfiction and see that this has always been thus. Some of you guys probably are familiar with the recent, or relatively recent sort of scandals involving, James Fry making stuff up in his memoir. But really, it goes back to the very beginnings of nonfiction. That one of the founding documents, practically, of Western civilization is Thucydides' book, The History of the Peloponnesian Wars. And in that book, Thucydides makes up the general speeches. To me, that's just a very telling fact, or fact, I guess, that this book that we worship as one of the first books of Western history, that is one of the first books of Western literature, ostensibly a work of nonfiction, the author of that book has invented the general speeches. So too in another famous work, Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater is a virtually fictional account of de Quincey's addiction to and recovery from opium, and yet that book is understood to be a classical work of British autobiography. So too Edmund Gauss's book called Father and Son, that was it's a book written when Gauss was 57. It's full of long dialogues between father and son when the boy was 8. It was written 45 or 50 years after the supposed events, but there's all this sort of supposedly verbatim dialogue between the father and son. And that book, too, was also questioned by all of the Gauss relatives and friends and family. And one last example, George Orwell's classical essay, Such Were the Joys, a great account of his brutal experience at a British boarding school. That book, that essay too, almost all of Orwell's classmates questioned virtually every detail of that essay. So I guess the thing I'm trying to argue is that nonfiction has been a vexed thing from the very beginning. That nonfiction in a way has its own stutter, you might say, its own weird limbo land between fiction and nonfiction, and that we kind of are childlike, or almost worse, perhaps lawyerly, when we try to think of nonfiction as this absolutely true thing, this absolutely transparently, provably true thing, whereas I think if we're honest about ourselves, that we know, as I say, that memory is a kind of dream machine. The moment that we compose, we make stuff up. There's a line in my book in which I say, I can't write a note to my daughter's 11th grade humanities teacher without little lies leaking in, or something like that. I think that may just be me and my pathological liarness, but I think that there's something that we know about language, about memory, about knowledge, that it's not absolute. And part of one of the big arguments of the book is to try to argue for a much more sophisticated notion of nonfiction. Try and rescue nonfiction as art. Yes, there is nonfiction as scholarship, there's nonfiction as journalism, but I want to say there's also this ancient and glorious tradition going from, say, from Thucydides to, say, Joan Didion, that is nonfiction as art. And I want us to think about it in a much more sophisticated way. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I got to this point. As I say, both of my parents were journalists. I grew up very much sort of worshiping the written word and worshiping nonfiction. And so my big rebellion was to become not a writer of nonfiction, but a writer of fiction. This was my sort of massive Oedipal, a rebellion, was to become a slightly different writer than my parents were. And so the first 3 books I wrote were works of fiction, 3 novels, a book called Heroes, a book called Dead Languages, which Bert mentioned, and a 3rd book, a novel and stories called Handbook for Drowning. And I was very much invested in the idea of myself as a fiction writer, as I say, as a kind of mini rebellion against my parents' nonfiction. And to me, it was a terribly interesting moment in my writing life about a dozen years ago. I was working on what I thought was my 4th novel, a book called Remote. And that's a book that became this book called Remote, Reflections on Life in the Shadow of Celebrity. And I found, to my surprise and perhaps horror, that I just could not get the novelistic machinery to operate. All of the usual gestures that a fiction writer makes, such as creating a plot, creating characters, creating a setting, creating backstory, creating scenes, I just found myself sort of almost literally unable to do. And by all accounts, these things are apparently pretty important to novels, plots and characters and scenes. And I think what I found with that book, it's sort of what I call my Alice down the rabbit hole moment, where I just sort of lost touch with the novel and have never quite come back to it, is that that book is very much a staging of my deep ambivalence. It's one I think that we all share, or perhaps many of us share, a deep ambivalence, a sort of love-hate relationship with mass culture. I was sort of both addicted to mass culture, pop culture, and also terribly repelled by it. And that book is my attempt to explore that in 52 interlinked meditations. And what I found in that book, and what I continue to find as myself as a writer and reader and teacher, is that I'm much more interested in writing a book that explores the war between myself, between my various selves, rather than expressing those feelings through a series of surrogate fictional selves. I'm terribly interested in myself as a sort of theme carrier, or as a sort of symbolic persona. And perhaps I'll read a couple of lines that I find terribly important along this line. Philip Lopate says that you are not important except insofar as an example that can serve to elucidate a more widespread human trait and thereby make readers feel less lonely and less freakish. And so too, William Butler Yeats says, it must go further still. That soul must become its own betrayer, its own deliverer, the one activity, the mirror turn lamp. And I guess that what I'm trying to say is that I'm really interested in work that is what I call, it's about what it's about. That it's like, let's say you want to write a book about your sort of furious love-hate affair with mass culture. I seem to want books that actually overtly wrestle with that, paragraph by paragraph, line by line, page by page, rather than constructing a sort of fictional narrative that sort of gives lip service to exploring that idea, but really isn't investigating it line by line. One other preface I thought I'd mention how I came to write this odd book is I was hired, I teach at the University of Washington in Seattle. I was hired there almost 20 years ago. I was hired as a fiction writer, and I felt after a while as if I were taking money under slightly false pretenses, because as my interest evolved away from fiction and toward nonfiction, I felt like I had to justify what I was actually interested in. So I developed this course, a graduate course on self-reflexive essay and on the self-reflexive documentary film. And the course pack for this course was this huge blue unwieldy binder full of literally thousands of quotations that I'd gathered over many years that were sort of my sort of life raft. They were sort of my favorite quotes, stuff I'd written, stuff other people had written, stuff I was actively newly writing, stuff said by, ancient writers, stuff said by contemporary writers, all arguing for the excitement of the non-fictional gesture. And year by year, this course packet got less it had less typographical errors in it. It had less repetition. The quotes went from thousands of quotes to perhaps hundreds of quotes. And then the big break for me was realizing I could start shoving these quotes into categories so that the passages about, say, memory all started to hang together. The passages about hip-hop started to hang together. The passages about risk and doubt and et cetera all started to hang together. And so the book began as a very organic process and stayed a relatively organic process, by which there's a lot of sort of controversy about the book now because it's built out of all of these quotations. But in reality, it kind of began as this actual course pack. And the arguments developed from me taking various people's quotations and then remixing them. So there is hope for us writer professors who can actually take course packets and make of them possible books. So what is the book? I mean, I've given you a lot of preface and background. What is the book? I think the book, Bert described it well, and I'm not sure I can improve on that greatly, but the book is sort of a call to arms to my fellow writers and creative artists to obliterate distinctions between fiction and nonfiction, to overturn laws regarding appropriation, and develop new forms for a new century. That's sort of the core of the book. The argument is that we live in this unbelievably simulated, artificial, and mediated world. And as human animals, that we have a deep need for reality that's not being met by old and crumbling forms of literature. One of the arguments of the book is that that from the beginning of time, writers have rated other writers. That, for instance, Shakespeare's Henry VI, 2/3 of that play is essentially lifted from Plutarch's Lives. What other examples do I have for you? James Joyce said, "I'm quite content to go down to posterity as a scissors and paste man." Certainly in the visual arts, Andy Warhol, Richard Prince, certainly in contemporary music, and certainly the appropriation experiments of people like Kathy Acker and William S. Burroughs. So much of what I'm trying to do is to reclaim for ourselves the writerly freedoms that writers have had from the beginning of time. And what I'm trying to argue is that in contemporary digital culture, that we need to be free to be able to pull from other text as much as previous writers pulled from other writers. The three epigraphs of the book might give you a bit of a handrail on the book. The first epigraph is from the German writer Walter Benjamin, who says, every great work of literature either dissolves a genre or invents one. That's sort of the biggest argument of the book that I'm making, that I'm trying to argue the most exciting work, in my view, is neither a conventional memoir that follows a relatively predictable path, or, to me, the relatively mainstream novel, which also is following a relatively predictable path, but specifically works that blur and defy genre. I'm trying to argue is the most exciting work. A good example of it for me is, I don't know if any of you know a film by Ross McElwee called Sherman's March. Is that a film any of you have seen or perhaps studied in classes? It's an extraordinary work. Do you know it? To me, it's a wonderful example of what I'm trying to get to, which is, it's very hard to locate that film. On the one hand, that film is a biographical portrait of General Sherman. On the other hand, it's a film very much about McElwee's ambivalence about the North and South. McElwee was born in North Carolina, moved to Massachusetts, and seems obsessed with the difference between the North and South. Third of all, the film is about McElwee's complicated relationship to various women in the South whom he's courting. Fourth of all, it's very much about a filmmaker and his relationship as a cameraman to the subjects that he's filming, and the way in which a camera can often colonize the space that it's filming. And it's also very much, believe it or not, about the rise of nuclear weapons during the Reagan administration. And what makes that film so exciting for me is that you never know exactly where you are. Are we in a documentary space? Are we in a confessional space? Is it an anthropological film? Is it a critique about Ross McElwee's love life? And the thing that's so exciting about the film is that he gets you to see the connections between private experience and public experience, between a political argument and an artistic argument. And to me, that creates a much more exciting artistic work than a work that is following a very pro forma direction, as for instance, take an extreme example like a romantic comedy whose contours are extremely well established before you watch it. So the strongest argument that the book is making is to argue for the excitement of genre-defying works. The second epigraph of the book is from Picasso, who says, art is theft. And the way I'm trying to use that is that throughout the book, I'm quoting a lot of different sources, as I've said. Some of the writing is from me, some of the writing is from other people, and some of the writing, I've taken what other people have written and have, you might say, scratched on it or remixed it, remade it. And I had a long, drawn-out argument with the publisher about this, as you might have suspected, that I argued long and hard. I consulted many copyright lawyers, and I wrote numerous memos to the publisher about it. And they finally said, you know, you can argue till you're blue in the face, we're not going to publish the book without citations. And so the compromise solution that we wound up with is the book has citations in the back of the book, but they're in very small type, and many of the citations are rather cryptic or even slightly misleading, in which I say, well, I couldn't quite find that quotation. And I also preface the appendix with a disclaimer in which I say, please, for the love of God, don't read these citations. Stop, read no farther. If you want to read the book the way I want it to be read, take out a box cutters and cut along the vertical dotted line that marks the last 10 pages of the book. And why am I doing this? Why am I going through so many cartwheels regarding the citations? Because just as I'm arguing for that the most exciting work resists genre, in precisely the same way, I want to argue for what a friend of mine calls the dubiety of the first person pronoun. Just like I want you to experience on a theoretical level that the most exciting work you can't quite locate, so too I want you to feel, well, who is the speaker? Is it Shields? Is it Sonny Rollins? Is it Schopenhauer? Is it some strange mix of all of them? Is it none of them? Is it all of them? And so the third epigraph of the book is from Graham Greene, who says, when we are not sure, we are alive. And that, to me, gathers the first argument about genre, the second argument about appropriation, and gathers it into this one final statement. Basically, the whole book is an ode to uncertainty, to doubt. To me, the best work plunges the reader into a kind of vertiginous doubt, into existential doubt. And this book both argues for it and tries to actually practice it at the same time. A lot of what I'm doing, I feel like, there was a term that Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan used 20 years ago. Forget exactly what he was describing, but he said, perhaps some of you, perhaps Andrea will know as a political scientist, but he was describing, he said, defining deviance downward. I forget exactly what he was describing. It's not exactly relevant. But I want to sort of kidnap that phrase because I want to, a lot of what I find in the contemporary discussion of nonfiction defines nonfiction downward. Basically, a huge amount of nonfiction is viewed as a subset of journalism, that everything gets vetted, James Fry, Charles Pellegrino, John DeGatta, Gerald Posner, seems like virtually every week, you remember the whole confusion about Shepard Fairey's Obama's Hope poster, the controversy regarding a Robert Capa photograph that was a staged photograph of a soldier falling. I mean, see, virtually weekly there's a confusion about what's real and what's not. And a huge amount of the contemporary discussion, I would say, defines nonfiction downward. It views it as a kind of, I don't know what, that we view it in a very childlike way, like, well, is it literally true? Were you wearing a purple sweater then or a magenta sweater then? Let's look at the photographs. Whereas what I want to do is what I call define nonfiction upward. That I want to take the very terms that nonfiction is supposedly based on and rotate them 180 degrees and use the supposed premises of nonfiction to make of nonfiction an incredibly interesting philosophical form. That is to say, if you take the grounds on which nonfiction is supposed to stand, truth, facts, and reality, and rotate those terms upward, you wind up with a deeply philosophical, deeply meditative, epistemologically sophisticated work. That is to say, the works of nonfiction I want to champion the works I'm trying to write and read and teach, the way I'm trying to push the culture and thinking about work, is that, to me, the best nonfiction, like, say, the Ross McElwee film, used nonfiction as a framing device to ask questions like, what's true? What's knowledge? What's memory? What's reality? What's a self? How much can a self know about the other? Do you see what I mean? That if you define nonfiction downward, it becomes this very pedestrian, very mundane, very, I don't know what, fact-based thing. If you rotate it upwards, you use its ostensible non-fictionality as a wonderful launching pad, or what do you call it, like a trampoline off which to bounce into asking these incredibly rich philosophical questions. And that's really a huge part of my strategy as a writer and reader and teacher and, I guess, manifesto writer. Part of the reason I'm interested in these sort of, in all this stuff, is that one of the titles that Bert mentioned was a book of mine that came out a couple of years ago called The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead. And I guess, I don't know what it is. More than most people, I suppose, I'm very aware that we're mortal. I'm perfectly healthy, thanks. I think I'm fine. You know, I've got some backaches, but that's about it. But I'm not a religious person. I don't have access to any religious faith. And so I'm terribly aware of mortality as a fact of human life. And for me, in that fact, writing is unbelievably important. That is to say, I think we are existentially alone on the planet. That is, I can't know what you're thinking and feeling, and you can't know what I'm thinking and feeling. And writing at its very best is a bridge that we construct across that abyss of human loneliness. And to me, writing is an unbelievably serious project. It actually connects human beings as well, perhaps better than any other human activity, because in my view, the best work does nothing less than show how the writer solved being alive. That's a pretty high charge, but it shows you that in the very best work, there's actually this sort of assuaging of loneliness between people. I think a good example of it is a book that I keep on championing. You would think that she might be my cousin or something, as much as I talk about this book, but I don't know her. But it's a book that I just love called Bluets by Maggie Nelson. It's sort of a perfect example of what I'm talking about. It's just a short book published by a small press, and believe it or not, ostensibly it's just a meditation on the color blue. It doesn't sound too promising. And then the meditation on the color blue becomes a meditation on Maggie Nelson being unable to get over the loss she feels over this love affair coming to an end. And then the bottom drops out even farther, and the book is very much about her friend who, as a result of a car accident, is now a quadriplegic. And the book keeps on getting larger and larger and larger, and deeper and deeper and deeper, and sadder and sadder and sadder. And you come to realize the book is about nothing less than something like the melancholy of the human animal. How do we live with loss? How do we live with the ultimate loss of the fact that we die? And so the books that I love the most, the kinds of books that Reality Hunger is trying to champion, seem to try to have as thin a membrane as possible between the writer and reader. They seem to try to get to something unbelievably real between writer and reader. They take extraordinarily seriously this conversation between writer and reader, and don't settle for what I call the entertainment. Like that, there's a wonderful line by Cynthia Ozick who says, I don't find entertainment entertaining, and that the kinds of work I seem to love the most, the kinds of books that I'm championing, are works of investigation. Samuel Johnson said, a work of literature should either show us how to endure existence. A work of literature should help us to enjoy existence, or should teach us how to endure existence. And the books that I seem to love a lot, the books that Reality Hunger is championing, seem to be more of the latter. They're actually showing you how to endure existence. They're actually showing you how the writer solved being alive. One of the ways that they do this is, for me, through literary collage. That many of the books that I'm talking about, the films like, say, Maggie Nelson's Bluets, Ross McElwee's Sherman's March, Amy Fusselman's The Pharmacist's Mate, Sarah Manguso's The Two Kinds of Decay, Spalding Gray's Morning, Noon, and Night, Simon Gray's The Smoking Diaries, or various books. Instead of putting as the energy of the work the narrative machinery of what happens next, the work feels collage-like to me. The writer goes wherever he or she wants to go, sometimes into fiction, sometimes into reportage, sometimes into diary, sometimes into political polemic. The writer goes wherever he or she wants to go to get deeper into their topic. And the effect of that for me is that the reader isn't reading just to turn pages. The reader is reading to find out how all the material comes together. And that, for me, is a more exciting readerly experience than simply reading for plot. I realize I'm probably in the minority. Probably a lot of you are saying, well, what's the matter with plot? I'm just trying to create an alternative version. Obviously, the mainstream novel, the mainstream Hollywood movie, the mainstream memoir still have most of the attention of the populace. I'm just trying to say there is this alternative tradition, this exciting counter tradition that goes back millennia, and it has great potentials for creative expression. I'll make a couple last points, and then I'll be happy to see how we are doing on time, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. One thing that I really seem to be arguing for is the virtue of speed, the virtue of concision, compression, velocity. That, part of my weariness and exhaustion and boredom with the contemporary novel is the incredibly glacial pace at which most mainstream novels happen. That we live in this unbelievably fast-paced culture. We live in this, digitally based culture that we live extremely, sort of speedy lives, both online and offline. And it seems to me just preposterous how much that we accept and tolerate kind of these glacially paced novels. They seem to be essentially escapes from contemporary culture rather than investigations of contemporary existence. And so one of the things that I'm trying, the works that I seem to love, I hope that an example of it is my own book, is works that have some of the compression and concision, the velocity and speed of contemporary culture. That I feel like that art, like science, moves forward. Art progresses, and as much as I admire the great works of the past, like, say, Madame Bovary, that we shouldn't continue to use that as a model. That all great works of literature broke from the past. That Virginia Woolf is a great writer because she broke from what she was reading. And the reason that we read Virginia Woolf now is because she pushed the novel and literature forward. And so many of the works that we now hold up as admirable works of contemporary literature are, in my view, simply repeating the literary discoveries and formal movements of really the mid-20th century. There's a wonderful line by Friedrich Nietzsche who said, "My ambition is to say in 10 sentences what everyone else says in a whole book, or rather what everyone else does not say in a whole book." That, that there's a wonderful fact that when we write concisely and in a compressed way, that it sort of pushes us toward greater candor, toward rawer nerves, toward more sort of discomforting thoughts. It's kind of like the line that, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long letter. It's harder to write short, it's harder to write brief, because there's nowhere to hide. If you write, say, a paragraph letter to someone, as if you write a 10-page letter, you can sort of hide amidst all the morass of words. But if you write a postcard and it's not a very fully felt or carefully considered postcard, you're exposed, I think. And lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about boredom. There's a wonderful line of Kafka's that probably gets quoted too much by me as well. This whole idea of, a book should be an axe to break the frozen sea within us. I mean, that's maybe a little bit melodramatic or a little corny, but I really love that line, and I take it quite seriously. That to me, books are not just entertainment or just Mandarin formal experiments. They're really this quite serious attempt to break the frozen sea within us and to have this really quite essential kind of communication between people. And so much of my impulse as a writer and reader and here a kind of theorist is to try to argue for works that do exactly that. And I don't know how many of you are writing students or aspiring writers, but I guess the thing I'd leave you with a bit is this idea of trying to find a form that releases your best intelligence. That I was writing fiction, I was writing it relatively well, but there was something about the form that I think was not releasing my best intelligence. And for whatever reason, I sort of crab walk sideways toward the sort of literary nonfiction, toward the lyric essay. And I found a form that I think allows me to express my best and deepest and I hope most interesting self. So for any of you in the creative arts, whether painting or music or writing or whatever, I think I would just urge you to be as assiduous as possible in trying to find a form in which you can express your deepest self. So on that note, I shall stop, and if you have questions, comments, disagreements, please speak up.